unfortunately, we did not manage to reach unanimity yesterday. Hungary was unable to support.
Hungary has blocked $55 billion in EU aid for Ukraine.
There are others. That's rudeness, isn't it? When you do something that you think is good for you, but you don't care what happens to the others. And I'm sure I could find arguments for how well-founded the Brussels decision was.
So I think Europe today is heading toward war. I feel that European leaders don't perceive that they're playing with fire.
Ursula von der Leyen is facing her worst nightmare after Viktor Orban blocked EU funding for Ukraine yet again. And this time, the fallout is far more explosive than Brussels expected. Because Hungary didn't just stop the money. It exposed a political fracture inside the EU that leaders have been hiding from the public for years. And now a chain reaction is unfolding across Europe, reshaping alliances, igniting rebellion, and threatening the very strategy Brussels has built around the Ukraine war.
Hungary has once again positioned itself as the outlier in the European Union. This time, obstructing Brussels' latest push to funnel billions.
Hungary didn't just block the EU's 50 June and $60 billion Ukraine package. It collapsed the entire summit and left 26 leaders staring at a dead end. This wasn't diplomacy. This was a power play, a reminder that the entire EU machine falls apart the second Budapest says no.
As the EU scrambles to sustain Kiev's war effort, Budapest refuses to be dragged into what it sees as a reckless continuation.
Orban made it crystal clear. No more blank checks for Ukraine until Brussels hands over every euro it froze from Hungary, turning von der Leyen's proudest funding plan into a hostage crisis of her own making.
Hungary remains defiant. Foreign Minister Peter Szijjártó, speaking on national television channel M1, dismissed the proposal as another reckless step by Brussels.
Foreign Minister Peter Szijjártó didn't soften a single word. He slammed the EU's plan as another reckless step, accusing pro-war liberals of actively undermining US-Russia negotiations, the only talks that could end this conflict. His warning was blunt. Brussels wants to dump billions into a battlefield that's already bleeding Europe dry, at a time when ammunition stockpiles are collapsing, economies are slowing, and citizens across the continent are tired of paying for a war they never voted for.
Warning that Hungary will not support an initiative that prolongs the war.
That's why Hungary drew a new red line. Any EU action that risks derailing the US-Russia peace channels gets an automatic veto. Because unlike the Commission, Budapest still understands that blindly escalating a losing war is not a strategy. It's self-destruction.
Meanwhile, the European Commission President von der Leyen.
Brussels tried to project confidence, but Orban demolished that illusion the moment he turned to the EU's most sacred political project, Ukraine's future inside NATO and the European Union. In Parliament, he said out loud what European leaders only whisper behind closed doors. Ukraine's NATO path is dead, buried the moment Washington shifted priorities, and Moscow drew its final red lines.
The official European Union position that by 2030, the European Union must be ready for a war to be fought against Russia.
Orban pushed even further, warning that Ukraine's fate, and whatever remains of its territory, will not be shaped in Brussels at all, but negotiated between the United States and Russia. He framed the EU as a powerless spectator, pretending to influence a geopolitical chessboard it no longer controls.
Right. In Brussels, it's no use for me to say, give us an exception, because that's what I say. And since sanctions require unanimity so far, if they didn't give it voluntarily, I just took it with a veto.
And then came the real blow. Orban declared that Ukraine will never join the European Union without explicit approval from the Hungarian people. Not the Commission, not the Council, the Hungarian people. With that one statement, he seized control of the entire accession process, reminding Brussels that Hungary holds a veto at every single stage and is fully prepared to use it.
So what I want to say is that the devastation of war is etched much deeper in the soul of the Hungarian people, and it operates much more deeply in our instincts than it does in many Western European politicians. That's why what is obvious to us, that war can only be bad, is not thought of the same way.
Instead of backing down, Orban escalated. He delivered a direct indictment of the entire Western strategy, declaring, The Ukraine experiment, a complete failure, strategically, militarily, and economically. He accused EU leaders of blindly following Washington into a war they don't control, reducing Europe to a subcontractor in a conflict it cannot win.
More money to Ukraine, more soldiers. These are steps that can combine into such a dangerous mixture that will suddenly explode.
Orban warned that Europe is being drained on every front. Weakened economies, soaring taxes, collapsing ammunition stockpiles, and an electorate exhausted by endless promises of a victory no one can define. By pouring money into Kyiv without oversight, accountability, or a realistic endgame, the EU is burning through resources while ignoring its own internal collapse.
Projecting a peace-first stance that embarrasses EU governments still pumping billions into a stalemate they cannot justify, while Hungary positions itself as the one European state capable of offering an actual exit ramp.
The final blow was unmistakable. Orban accused the EU of financing not a partner, but a crisis, warning that Kyiv is turning into a buffer zone between Russia and NATO, not the success story Brussels keeps selling. Orban then opened a new front, exposing what he says is the EU's real internal engine: war lobbies and defense interests, not democracy. He warned that Europe is being steered not by diplomacy, but by arms manufacturers and political insiders who profit as long as the war continues.
But the Europeans thought this would be the money they could get their hands on. And of course, they say this money will be given to Ukraine, but what will the Ukrainians actually spend it on? Well, for my part, I read in the news that the Ukrainians have made a deal with the French to purchase 100 fighter jets. With the Germans, we are increasing it. There are a huge number of massive arms deals going on here.
He pointed directly to the battle over the $230 billion in frozen Russian assets, arguing Brussels intends to channel that money into massive weapons deals. His examples were blunt: Ukraine negotiating for 100 French fighter jets, expanded German weapons packages, and multi-billion-euro contracts that overwhelmingly benefit Western defense companies. To Hungary, this isn't aid. It's a war economy disguised as solidarity, funded by European taxpayers.
This money, through a certain circulation, eventually ends up with them. And as we get deeper and deeper into the war, the economic lords of war, the warlords, want to exert ever stronger influence over decision-making.
Orban's final warning was even sharper. The longer this war continues, the more influence these warlords gain inside EU decision-making, pushing Europe toward a confrontation with Russia while smaller nations absorb the risks. Hungary will not be dragged into a conflict engineered by those who will never face the consequences themselves.
Spending some time reflecting on it. I bring this up only so that those who doubt that processes are underway in Europe that are heading in the wrong direction and pose a serious threat, and who think that Hungary should stray onto the Brussels path, and that it's only the foolish, civic, right-wing, national Christian government.
As Brussels runs out of options, Orban shifts from resistance to strategy. Hungary is positioning itself as Europe's only real peace broker. While the EU keeps pushing weapons, sanctions, and endless funding, Budapest is already preparing for the post-war landscape, opening direct channels with both Washington and Moscow, negotiating future economic cooperation with the US, and planning how to rebuild ties with Russia once sanctions inevitably fall.
Is that the pro-war liberals in Europe are conspiring to spend the money of the European people to prolong the war. More arms and more money for Ukraine.
He warns that Europe is drifting so far from diplomacy that it risks stumbling into a war it cannot avoid. In his view, Brussels has become an engine of escalation, not peace, and Hungary's only protection is stronger sovereignty, refusing to be dragged into decisions that endanger its security.
That has already happened. The second is when economic sanctions are imposed and economic cooperation is cut off. We've passed that stage as well. The third is when conscription is introduced and the transition to a war economy begins. That's where we are now.
Then comes his starkest warning. The 2026 Hungarian election will decide whether Hungary stays out of a coming conflict. Orban argues the EU's current trajectory could push Europe toward direct confrontation with Russia, and Hungary must prepare now or be swept into a crisis created by others. In his calculation, Brussels isn't the shield, it's the threat, And national sovereignty is Hungary's last line of defense.
The first and most important thesis statement, I think, is that whoever supports Ukraine supports the war. And since war needs money,
A far bigger problem now emerges for Brussels. Orban is no longer fighting alone. With Robert Fico back in Slovakia and Andrej Babiš returning in Czechia, a coordinated Central European bloc has formed inside the Council, united in blocking Ukraine aid, rejecting new sanctions, and stopping Brussels from dictating war policy. For the first time, von der Leyen faces a group strong enough to break EU consensus at will.
Ukraine supports the war. And since war needs money, whoever supports Ukraine and thus the war also supports tax increases and money extraction from national governments, because Brussels.
The pushback isn't limited to funding. When Brussels launched its new Ukraine trade deal, Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia immediately refused to lift their national bans on Ukrainian imports. The message was unmistakable. These states will not follow EU directives that damage their economies or deepen the war.
The Hungarian leader argues the EU has lost sight of peace and turned Ukraine into a financial sinkhole.
Orban then hit Brussels with something even more serious: the EU's own plan to make Europe war-ready by 2030. He warned that the EU has already crossed key steps of wartime mobilization: diplomatic rupture, sanctions, and economic conversion, leaving only direct confrontation ahead. Brussels frames this as strategy. Orban calls it a march toward war.
And tonight, Orban's message lands like a hammer. Hungary will not fund Ukraine's self-inflicted chaos, will not save a collapsing government, and will not join Brussels in pretending Kyiv is winning.
He also accused Brussels of ignoring Hungary's national survival. EU sanctions crush Hungary's energy security while barely touching Western Europe. Orban contrasted Trump granting Hungary exemptions with the EU denying every request. His position is simple: when Hungary's economy is at risk, the veto is non-negotiable. Orban also exposed the EU's leverage tactics. Brussels is ready to approve tens of billions for Ukraine, while still withholding Hungary's own frozen funds. Budapest labels this exactly what it is: financial pressure disguised as rule of law.
Ukraine keeps choosing escalation over peace.
Meanwhile, von der Leyen is searching for workarounds to bypass Hungary, joint borrowing, asset-backed loans, new budgetary mechanisms. But even these are meeting resistance. Belgium has already warned that using frozen Russian assets poses major legal and financial risks, undermining von der Leyen's escape routes. And finally, the supposed breakthrough on Ukraine's EU accession was nothing but theater. Hungary didn't approve it. Orban simply stepped out of the room, allowing the vote to proceed, while retaining veto power over every future stage. Brussels can announce progress, but Budapest controls the timeline. And Orban made sure everyone knows it.